Okay, starting off where I left off yesterday, pre-zygotic versus post-zygotic barriers. Just a quick little recap. Pre-zygotic barriers prevents different species from successfully mating before the zygote is formed, obviously.
That's what I was getting at yesterday. Okay.
Post-zygotic barrier are barriers that occur that reduce the chance of the offspring surviving or reproducing. This happens after the zygote's already formed. Sometimes the zygote does not live out till adult age. Sometimes the zygote, as for example, the mule becomes sterile, doesn't work, hybrid breakdown, etc. I don't have any questions about that. So remember, the main definition of species in the book was biological species concept. But here are some other different definitions that they use. Morphological species concept distinguishes a species by body shape and other structural features. Ecological defines a species in terms of ecological niche, the sum of how members of the species interact with the non-living and living parts of the environment. And phylogenetic defines a species the smallest group of individuals that share a common ancestor from one branch in the tree of life. Remember, the biological species concept compared the genotypes and phenotypes of each organism to one another. These compare different characteristics.
Okay, so now we have the process of allopatric association. And if we recall, just remember that gene flow is the transfer of alleles from one population to another. And allopatric speciation occurs when gene flow is interrupted, when a population is separated, when geographical changes occur. So an example of this is when there's a lake and the water level drops and it creates two smaller lakes, and therefore there are two populations of a new species. And however, this can also occur without geographic changes. The example here is the flightless cormorant, which most likely originates in this way from an ancestral flying species, but right now it can't fly and it's on the Galapagos Islands. So the process of allopatric speciation, geographic barrier has to be formidable to prevent animals such as birds and mountain lions from breaching it. But some animals, such as rodents, find smaller barriers more formidable than others. And once geographic separation has occurred, the gene pools may diverge, and this leads to allopatric speciation. And when this occurs, different mutations, genetic drifting, and natural selection leads to a change in that population. Reproductive isolation may then arise also as a byproduct selection of the drift. And this causes separate populations to diverge genetically. An example is this fish, the Gambusia hoopsie in the Bahamas, where the water level changed in ponds, creating a whole bunch of different smaller ones. And some of the ponds have they're called high predation because they have lots of fish that eat these, and other ones do not. So the ones that live in the so-called high predation ponds, they have a sleeker body type, so it allows them for short bursts of speeds, whereas the other one have a body type that's built to swim longer. So there's many evidence of allopatric speciation. An example is the 30 species of snapping shrimp that live in the genus, there are the genus Alpheus that live off the Isthmus of Panama, and 15 species live on the Pacific side and 15 on the Atlantic side. And before the isthmus formed, it was concluded that gene flow must have occurred. And there's evidence that there are sibling species on either side of the isthmus, as these species are likely originated 9 to 3 million years ago, and the isthmus formed about 10 to 3 million years ago. So another example is there was a fly experiment done by Diana Dodd at Yale University, and she conducted an experiment raising some flies only on starch and others using maltose. And after 40 generations, which took about a year to breed, natural selection resulted in divergent evolution. So the populations raised on starch digested it better over time, and the same goes for the maltose group. And then she then tested mating using the different groups of flies. And when the flies from the starch population were mixed with those from the maltose population, they tended to mate. However, in the control group, the starch fly is mating only with flies from their own population. And so like the flies that were adapted to starch when mixed with the maltose were still more likely to mate with the starch ones since that was that species. And if you look here, here's the graph from the book. So the experiment showed the reproductive barriers slowly forming in between these two species. And if you look here, this was the control group. So you have the different starch populations. And here's female and male, and they mixed together both because they were both raised on starch. But if you look here, when the starch and the maltose flies were mixed, there was a significant less number of starch and maltose flies that mated rather than starch versus starch. And this is just an example of allopatric speciation happening in a laboratory setting.
Yeah, the only problem, it's an interesting experiment. The only problem I have with it is that there still is mating, and we haven't created a different species.
Yeah, it's still
just a
the
different
same.
strain of that species is
Mhm.
what I'm seeing here. Is a new strain development rather than a new species development. Because if it became impossible for them to reproduce,
Then it would be a whole different species.
that'd be a whole different
Yeah.
ballgame, yeah. Okay.
I think that was kind of the answer to my question, so I was gonna ask what's the difference between like a different strain and then a completely different species?
Right, it's like a different breed, it's like different breeds of dogs. You know, Great Danes are more likely to mate with other Great Danes. And collies more likely with collies. If you were to mix them all, males and females, it'd probably be a similar thing where the male and female Great Dane of being similar sized animals would likely mate with each other. They're different breeds or strains. So I guess we could use the word breed here. But species, no, they're the same species. But, you know, do you call a toy poodle a different species than a Great Dane because they can't mix? Because really, in a sense, they have a pre-zygotic barrier, don't they? We're talking, or a Chihuahua, let's just say a Chihuahua. They're very small dogs. Great Danes are very large dogs. Male and female of the two breeds, I don't care which one you mix. How are they gonna make this all happen? They can't.
Well, if they potentially could, then it would become a post-zygotic barrier, right? Because a poodle have no way.
Well, there wouldn't be a post-zygotic barrier as long as the bigger dog can carry to term, because there wouldn't be hybrid breakdown, there wouldn't be sterility there, because they're really genetically, they're not a different
If the
species.
smaller dog tries to bear it,
Oh, it would die before
then
giving birth.
that'd be considered to be post, right?
That would be post, yeah. The only pre-zygotic barrier there between the Chihuahua and the Great Dane is the fact that they cannot copulate. What do we call that?
Mechanical.
Mechanical isolation, exactly, yes. So there's a few flaws, there's a few flaws you have to understand.
Okay, but so then is this process just to describe like two species forming or two?
Yeah,
because
what she's doing in this experiment is showing how two species might actually form.
Like over time, there was like a reproductive
Oh,
barrier
right.
that formed.
But so then usually this process is just kind of to explain like something bad happening and then two species kind of going off and then developing on their own.
Yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily bad. I mean, you, Cameron, you said this so perfectly. I mean, you know, like, there's that formidable barrier they just can't breach, and therefore they just start
Okay.
doing
They
their
go
own
in their own
thing.
direction.
Yeah, going their own direction, thank you.
Right, so the importance of allopatric speciation. It's also suggested by the fact that regions that are more highly isolated and subdivided by barriers have more species. And lab tests and further experiments also suggest that reproductive isolation increases with a larger distance. And scientists tested this using dusky salamanders, which are these right here. And they brought these salamanders in from different populations and observed their ability to reproduce. And there was little reproduction isolation in salamanders from neighboring populations, but the farther the populations were separated, they weren't able to mate at all, which was a result that was consistent with allopatric speciation. And researchers also tested whether intrinsic reproductive barriers develop when populations are isolated in experiments. And these animals were subjected to different environments, and the results showed the same thing yet again. And while geographic isolation prevents inbreeding, physical separation is not a biological barrier to reproduction. So basically what scientists have concluded that it is only like a biological barrier that can prevent inbreeding when members of different populations are put together.